it's Mr. Frazier. Good morning. It is Wednesday, April 1st. Um, just a quick announcement. You should already know from the parent letters or from your friends or from earlier announcements, but I am postponing the country report indefinitely. I hope to do it when we get back, whether that's at the end of this year, hopefully, or even next year, because I think it's important that you learn how to do footnotes and bibliographies and learn about these great countries. However, because of how big the assignment is and the fact that you would have to do it basically by yourself, along with, learning math and history and everything else off the internet, just seems unfair. Anyways, we will do it, just not right now. We are going to review the fall of Rome. We already talked about that in the past, but it's very important. And we're going to see how the fall of Rome gave rise to the Middle Ages. And we're going to talk about the Middle Ages a little bit. When you think of the Middle Ages, you think of knights in armor and dragons and all that stuff. Some of that stuff is true. A lot of it is false. We're going to try and get into it. All of this stuff is very complicated. I hope that when we get back to class that we'll be able to talk about it more. But this is just a little clarification. Remember, you should be reading up for your book, reading up in your book for your tests and your homework. Speaking of tests, you have a test tomorrow. I will post it on Dropbox unless you want me to email it to you, any of your parents or parents that may be listening, or if you have an email address, let me know. If not, I will post it to Dropbox, and the study guide was sent out. It's pretty self-explanatory. There will be a section that's not from the book that's about our keynote on some of the stuff from Rome we talked about. It's basically just your Rome worksheet with the questions moved around a little bit. So it's all in that action. All right, without further ado, let's talk about the fall of Rome. While I take a sip of my coffee. So, the fall of Rome. Remember, it's not just one thing, and it's not something that just one day everything was going great, then all the barbarian hordes came in and everything went to heck in a handbasket. There were a number of issues. Number one, in my opinion, would be the corruption. The people who were running the show cared more about making themselves rich than doing a good job. You can't have that. That's not how you run an empire, especially in times of crisis. When the Romans really needed strong leaders, that was the time that they were at their breaking point, and there was no Trajan, there was no Augustus. So that was a big deal. The weakened army, Romans, Italians, even Roman citizens themselves from other parts of the empire were not fighting in the army anymore. So they were starting to use conscripts, or people who were kind of incentivized or even forced sometimes to fight, but people who didn't have a stake in the Roman Empire the way that Roman citizens did. The financial depression, people were out of jobs, people were you can't pay your army, you can't keep the roads fixed if people are broke. And finally, the invading armies. Now, the invading armies get the most press. You have the Huns that are marauding around. You have German hordes invading and sacking Rome. And they certainly were a problem. I mean, they burned the city down. But they were just one symptom in a greater whole. All right. It's important to remember that the fall of Rome, I'm using air quotes that you can't see, is only the western half of the empire. Remember, Constantinople and the eastern half still continue to exist for hundreds of years. So the city of Rome falls to the Visigoths, but Constantinople and the eastern half of the empire in Greece and Turkey and Palestine continue to exist for hundreds of years. They wore togas, they called themselves Romans. So saying the fall of Rome only means half of it. Imagine if the United States fell apart, but it was only the western half. So everything from, you know, Texas east continued to exist, but the western half fell to the zombie hordes. That's what we're talking about here. There is still an entire large section of people who would have thought of themselves as Rome. It's not just the whole thing falls apart. The eastern half of the empire continued to thrive. Constantinople becomes the capital of this new Byzantine Empire. We're going to refer to this in the past as the Byzantine Empire because the city that Constantine the Great built, he showed up, it was just a small fishing village called Byzantium. And when he came, he transformed it into this huge megacity and named it after himself. But the fishing village, Byzantium, gives the empire its name. So it's called the Byzantine Empire. Now today, it's called Istanbul, and it's the biggest city in the country of Turkey, because the Byzantine Empire lasts for almost another 1,000 years, but in 1453, the Ottoman Turks do capture that. We'll talk about it later in the book. But the Byzantine Empire is the east, and we have a map of it right here. So you see kind of the light orange color. There was a time when the Byzantine Empire managed to reconquer Rome. So the Byzantine Empire at one point in time was almost as big as the original Roman Empire. But for most of its existence, it was that territory you see in the dark, I don't even know what that color that is, dark peach. However, the western half does kind of fall apart. The Germanic tribes invade from the north and east. This part will be on your test. It is the Visigoths first, and then the Vandals that invade and sack the actual city of Rome. In fact, the Vandals were so kind of well known for burning and looting that we still use the term vandal or vandalize to explain or describe somebody like messing up a town center. So if you did graffiti, they would say that you vandalized the wall or whatever. But it's these Germanic tribes that will set up the kingdoms that we're going to talk about going forward. So the Anglo-Saxons will create the country that will be called England. In fact, the Angles conquer most of it, and people start referring to it as Angleland. That's the land of the Angles, Angleland, and that's where we get England. And the Franks, of course, give the name to France. So the two major European countries of England and France are established by these barbarian tribes, quote unquote, that managed to defeat the Romans. And when they do, they give rise to what we call the Middle Ages. Now, historians use numbers to categorize time. But obviously, it's not like in 500 AD, everybody decided, okay, it's no longer Rome, it's now the Middle Ages. That clearly would never happen. When they use these numbers, it's kind of a way for us, looking back at it, to make a messy situation more neat. So we call the time before 500 BC, like way in the past, call it, the ancient times or almost prehistory. Then 500 BC to 500 AD is the classical age. That's Greece, Athens, Sparta, Alexander the Great, and Rome. From 500 to 1500 are called the Middle Ages. Also, people have called them the Medieval Age or the Dark Ages. Now, the Middle Ages have kind of gotten a bad rap because people look at the Romans and they built these monuments and the aqueducts, and the Greeks philosophized and they were so smart, and they look at the Middle Ages as, look at these big old dummies. They didn't do anything. But that's not entirely fair. The Middle Ages did not see learning in the same way that Greeks and Romans did, But these people were not just idiots. They built, huge churches. The Church of Notre Dame that recently burned in Paris, that was built in the Middle Ages. Trebuchets, catapults, castles. All of those things are impressive. Anyway. So it's not just as clear cut as all that. And then finally, we call the modern age from 1500 to the present. The Renaissance starts around 1500, and then today, obviously, we are modern. All right, feudalism. This is what normally we'd be talking about a lot in Mr. Fraser's class. Feudalism is the exchange of land for military service. So, let's say that I conquered a territory, and I conquered all of Los Angeles. And because I conquered it, I now own it. I am the king. But Los Angeles is a big kingdom, and I can't operate it all by myself because it's too big. And also, I want to reward all of my noble warriors who helped me conquer this territory. So I would give out pieces of land in return for military service. So I would give cash, all of Inglewood, and he would own that land and he would make money off of it. And I would give, Lucy all of, Pasadena or whatever, and I would give Kingston all of the San Fernando Valley, and each one of those people would make a lot of money off the land that I gave them. But then they would also be required to train troops, so that if I wanted to get in a fight and conquer San Diego, I'll be like, okay, Cash, Lucy, Kingston, you each need to bring 10,000 armed men to fight in battle for me. And they owed me that military service because I gave them that land. That's feudalism. So the king gives out the land and then gets warriors in exchange. And the king gets his power because he owns that land and is giving it. So it's this trade. You don't trade money necessarily. You trade land for service. Now let's say that Cash has a big kingdom, right? That he got from me, but he wants to give some of it to Quante, and Quante gets a portion of the area, 10 square blocks, and he gets that money, and then he owes military service to Cash. So each person down the line looks to the lord above them as the person that they serve in exchange for land. And this goes all the way down to the serfs. So you have the king at the top. In the instance, the example I'm making, I would be the king, and I give land to my vassals. The blue section of the pyramid, that's Lucy and Cash and Kingston in our example. Then they, in turn, would give land out to other people. So Cash gives some land to Quante and Kasha, and Kingston gives some land to Noah and Aaron, and on and on and on, all the way down to the peasants or serfs who work the land. And now the peasants didn't own the land. So let's say that Kingston gave some to Aaron, and Aaron's a local lord. He would have a number of peasants who worked his land, and they didn't really, they were poor. It was not awesome to be a serf. But they would work the land and get to keep some of the food that they grew. That was their payment. And the Lord would protect them from other people trying to hurt them. So it was still a trade. The serf promised to work the land of their Lord in exchange for protection and food. So feudalism is basically this trade of land for some kind of service, whether it's military service, fighting in the armies, or whether it's just, protection and the ability to eat. So the lords and ladies were at the top, the aristocracy. There were big lords and ladies that you see in the blue section, And there could be minor nobles like knights and people who owned just a little bit of land but still owned their land and therefore had some money. Then the peasants were at the bottom. The manor was the name of the house, not the name of the house, sorry. The manor was the name of the land that the Lord owned. So, if you've ever watched Batman, Wayne Manor is not the house, it's the whole thing. It's the Batcave underneath, it's the gardens outside. And the manor house was obviously the place where the Lord and the lady lived. Now, early in the Middle Ages, manor houses were just kind of, big fancy houses. But as people started to fight more and more and technology grew, they started strengthening their manor houses and they built castles. And castles are basically fortified houses. So if you're the Duke of, Sherman Oaks, like Kingston, you want to make sure that no other person comes and takes all your stuff, so you got to build a castle. And the castles were defensive, right? You couldn't come in and try and get Kingston or any of the nobles if he was hiding in that castle, because he would have guys on top of the walls shooting arrows at you. They would be, hurling boiling hot water at anybody trying to get in. It was trying to get into a castle was very, very difficult. They were well fortified. And just to make things even harder, getting up that wall would be very difficult, or punching a hole through the wall would take, weeks and weeks of using catapults. But they would make it even harder. They would dig a ditch surrounding it. That's called a moat. Now, when we think of a moat, we think of a ditch surrounding a castle filled with water. And many of them were filled with water. But some of them were just deep ditches, and they would put sharp sticks or other things in it. And the idea was just to make it difficult. If you're trying to run to the castle and get up the walls, the people inside want to make that as hard as possible. So if you just have to run straight, that's not too difficult. You can run with your ladder and try and get up. But if you have to run down a ditch that has, spikes in it and all kinds of stuff, as you're running down and climbing up, they're still throwing rocks and shooting arrows and burning hot stuff on you. It was all a way to make it harder to get in. Then the drawbridge was obviously a bridge that you could let down so people you want coming in could come in. And then you pull it up so people can't get in. Now, castles were difficult to make. They started out wooden. The earliest castles were just, they would dig a ditch and they would put a mound of dirt from everything they dug out, and they would build kind of a wooden fort on top of it, which would be good and relatively easy to build. However, that's not a permanent structure, and you could probably already see a major problem with building a wooden castle. If you're inside a wooden castle, people can burn it, and then you're in trouble. So then they started making them out of stone. And stone castles, obviously, much stronger. However, they're much more expensive and time-consuming to build. Anyways, we'll talk more about castles if we have time later. The last thing we're going to talk about today are knights. Now, when we think of knights in shining armor like this bad boy. And knights certainly did wear plate mail, which is that kind of armor. But what a knight was simply meant a man that owned land and could afford to ride a horse. Horses were expensive back then. You can think of horses in the past as like cars today, but you couldn't get a horse loan. You'd have to buy the car straight up. Now, cars are expensive, and if you're going into battle, you don't want to drive a Ford Pinto into battle, right? You got to drive, a Lambo. You got to drive something sweet. So a knight needed to be able to afford a very nice horse, a war horse. And so in order to buy a horse, and not just one, often there'd be multiple, you needed to have some money. So knights were not just people who were, good at fighting, although they were. It was somebody who owned land. So if you were a knight, you were above the common folk. Um, Knights were trained warriors that were kept by the Lord. So if the Lord owned some land, he would give some of that as part of feudalism to men who would then fight for him. Um, if you were a knight, hopefully when we get back, I'll be able to talk more about this. If you were a knight, your whole life was devoted to warfare. You're kind of like a samurai. Knights didn't, you know, also thatch roofs or also cook food. They were just knights. That's all they did. And they trained and they fought and they were willing to die for their lord. They had armor to protect them. Chainmail is a type of armor that's a little bit lighter, and it's like hundreds and hundreds of tiny little metal rings all sewn together. And that was more maneuverable, but obviously, arrows can shoot through chain links. So if you wanted to go all out, you could do plate mail, which is what you see this guy wearing, which is actual plates of metal that had to be made for the specific knight. Because if you are somebody who's a different height, or if your arms are a little bit longer or shorter than somebody else, so getting a suit of armor was incredibly expensive. And so knights had to be able to afford a horse. They had to be able to afford armor. They had to be able to afford weapons. They had to be able to afford servants, right? If you're a knight, you're not going to carry all your own stuff. So only the richest, noblest people were knights, and they and their friends were the military elite. And we're going to talk more about medieval combat later, but I'm just going to finish today's lecture by saying that the Middle Ages society was stratified. If you were a peasant at the bottom, you had no money, you had no land, you had no weapons, and you had very few rights. If you were a noble, if you were a lord, then you had money, you had land, you had weapons, and you were stuck in your class. So if your father was the Duke of Cambridge, well, then you were doing pretty well. But if your father was a dirt farmer, peasant, serf, well, then life was going to be tough for you. The one thing you had was you could look forward to eternity in heaven. Now, the fall of Rome, we're going to talk a lot about this on Friday and next week. The Roman Empire falls in the west, but what rises is the Christian church that Constantine had established. So the empire falls, but the church remains. Each church in every Roman town, the Pope in the famous city of Rome, still maintains their power. I'm going to talk a lot about the Middle Ages church because in some ways it's a very good thing, but in other ways it's a very, very bad thing. And the medieval church was not the church that we think of today. Think of Chapel on Friday. That is not what was going on 1,000 years ago. But it's important to learn about. We will do that either Friday or Monday when we get back from spring break. Anyways, I miss you guys like mad. I hope these lectures are helping. I hope you're getting everything done. If you're falling behind, please let me know. I've intentionally tried to give less homework this week so that people could catch up. I know you got math and grammar and God knows what else. But be in contact with me, please, if you don't understand. All right. Praying for you, and I will see you soon.